Hello, everybody. My name is Oscar Baechler, and I'm here to talk about 10,000 Swords, a Geometry Nodes vertical slice. This was a Geometry Nodes project that I did a few months back, and I'm happy to tell you more. So, first off, a little bit about me. My name is usually found on the internet as Ogbog, and I'm oftentimes known in the Blender user group as like a user group guy. I started the Seattle Blender user group about 15 years ago, and it's been going strong. In fact, 5 years ago, you can see a picture of me doing a talk on our 10-year anniversary and how to keep user groups going. And we survived the pandemic, and I'm a big believer in, kind of like what the conference was all about, getting people in the same room and existing in meet space and being able to talk face to face. I just always think that's the best experience. But just to show you some examples of how far back this goes, this first picture 13 years ago, we've got Delay Felinto, Ian Hubert, Nathan Begdahl, and Mike Pan in this photo, various people in the Blender community. And we're still going. You can go to meetup.com/cbug, and you can see here's our user groups today, still going strong and hanging out. And I also teach at Lake Washington Institute of Technology. Here you can see me taking some students to the Fry Art Museum. I do various things in the design and game department and traditional media and traditional art programs at Lake Washington. I've also done contracting for Pokemon on a number of occasions, specifically for the World Championships in 2022 and 2023. So it's always been one of my favorite dream jobs. And also, I wrote a book on Blender. This came out right around the pandemic starting, and I wrote this with Zuri Greer, who is also giving a talk at the Blender conference. And here you can go buy it if you want. It's got 700 pages. It's a machine. It's gigantic. And obviously, I just do lots of art. I like drawing and I like painting. Here's more. Here's some stuff from my concept art class. I'm just making little cubes, including how to make a Blastoise. And obviously, I'm on the internet. You can find me almost everywhere under the moniker Ogbog, and I encourage you to follow me. Except I'm getting off all of these things, so a lot of these I don't do anymore. I think, the internet's probably pretty bad for us. We should all get off of it. Oh yeah, here's my two children, and they're starting to use Blender as well. So this is a sculpture done by my son Felix, who's got the orange hair. But let's get on to the Swordtember, and specifically my thought process on this as a Geometry Nodes project. You can go to this URL and download the final file, by the way. And it has all these different swords, kind of been a mess, and all the different tools and little utilities that I designed inside of there. So even if you don't necessarily need to make a sword, a lot of these little functions that I'm going to show, you can go and grab and throw into your Geometry Nodes file. So it was summer of 2023, and I was just sitting around. As a teacher, a lot of times I don't have anything to do during the summer, and I saw Swordtember come up on blenderartists.com, and it had this list of who wields the sword for the 2023 theme. And I'm generally against doing monthly themes. I think it drains you, it takes a lot of time. But I started thinking, because I've been doing so much stuff with Geometry Nodes, both for client work and showing it off at the Seattle Blender user group, and just in my own practice. And I realized, well, what if instead of just making 30 swords, which doesn't sound like something I want to do, what if I made a generator that could make infinite swords? And that sounded like a much better use of my time. And the way Geometry Nodes works is you start sitting there thinking about, how could I do this? And you just feel those wheels spinning in your brain, and then you got to sit down and get in the nodes because you want to see that idea that you came up with come to life. So I decided I was going to make some swords in Geometry Nodes. My design restrictions were, one of these was after the fact. I started realizing Geometry Nodes takes a lot more work than just traditional modeling to get all those parameterized utilities. And so I noticed a few months later, November came out, and their rule was specifically one thing every 2 days, because they recognized it's not like box modeling a sword. It takes a little more work. And so I decided in post, or after the fact, I would try to aim for that. I would aim for not 30 swords, more like 15 swords. But again, it's a generator, so I can have as many as I want. I didn't want to focus on material or render design except in the form of passing attributes through geometry nodes so that it could be accessed in a material. But otherwise, I wasn't really designing like, brushed metal or, worn edges. I figured, I can just grab materials from the commons and, Blender's shared community of stuff and use those instead. I also, having worked with geometry nodes for a while, I thought a lot about the best practices for these things. And one of them is about what object type you should use. So, geometry nodes in its current state has mesh objects and curve objects that you can throw on. And when you throw it on a mesh object, you can then follow that up with all sorts of future modifiers, whether that is just a simple mirror modifier or a more fancy thing like a second geometry nodes thing. The problem with curves is it's a really useful data type to work on, but you can't follow it up with a bunch of things. And under the hood, it's always converting curves into meshes anyways. So as often as possible, I didn't use curves. I would use a mesh object and reference in a curve. I also found that a lot of these geometry nodes things are generators made of generators. You break it up into these little things, and a small utility can be used in multiple places. I also had a number of geometry nodes files and little tools and utilities I've used. I've also shared resources with other people who've also shared geometry node stuff on the end, on their end in the internet, and so I wanted to make sure that I'm not reinventing the wheel. And I don't want to have analysis paralysis. There's a completely different take on how to do swords, which would be, heavy on reference, heavy on historical accuracy, heavy on, how was this metal smelted and stuff. And I didn't want to focus on that. I wanted to just, be like a kid. You draw a sword in your little lined notebook and then you go for it. And then also, I think a lot about how do we interact with geometry nodes? And edit mode, I think, is where you see a lot of the core functionalities of what is a UI that you hand off to somebody using your geometry nodes versus what is something that's under the hood and the geometry nodes handles it. So I think people are going to tab into edit mode. They expect, if you're working on a curve object, that you can use Alt-S to scale a Bezier point and Control-T to twist it. As far as meshes go, you assume that you might be able to assign things for groups. You might use edge creases and then be able to access that data. And those were the main things that I thought about is, how are we using a small amount of edit mode for meshes and curves to get there? So simple version of a sword. This was sort of the architecture I was thinking about for the generic stuff. A sword is basically a giant line, but then you can break it up into this fulcrum where it splits into a handle and a blade, and so maybe that's it. And I thought maybe this is the two ways that you do this. Maybe you want it extending up or down. On the other hand, maybe you want one line that generates the whole curve, and you want to split that after the fact. And the other thing that I started realizing is a lot of times, going back to a generator made of generators, you would want to have an object that you reference in for the blade or the handle. And so that becomes a separate geometry nodes file for a specific sort of blade or handle or hilt object that you're starting to make. When you start getting more advanced, you have things like a pommel, the hilt, the langet, which is the little crystal thing that is sort of in the middle of the handle that the blade and the handle extend down from. You would want to be able to switch between options. Maybe you want to just crank a knob back and forth and have the sword be taller or shorter and curve left or right. On the other hand, maybe you want this to be in the interface. You want to just draw the curve yourself and bring that in. So I created a lot of user interface things that let you switch between those. And let me think. Again, I started implementing how would you be able to control things like the thickness, size, profile. What do you just automatically assume you can change if you had a bunch of sliders that determine how your blade is different from mine? When you got into advanced stuff, first off, again, avoid analysis paralysis. You find out all these sword chunks like the guard, the basket, and the quillion, and I started just checking out. I don't want to necessarily know every single thing that's ever existed on every sword ever. I also try to save my UI cleanup for this stage. I think a lot of times in the past when I've used geometry nodes, I've discovered that I'll start designing the UI too early, and then I realize there's like 5 different places where I've added a slider that can change the scale of something, and you oftentimes just want one. I also started figuring out stuff like, how can I fit these themes and make it really, really weird and sort of go really off-roading with how I make these swords. Because, it's 3D. It's for video games. People fight with yo-yos and umbrellas and stuff. And then, again, my generators started getting more and more complex. Here's some best practices I recommend. Make sure that, again, a mesh that you reference in a curve is better. Groups are something that I tend to, I don't like them as much as frames, because a lot of times when you do that, not only do you hide the information, but also if you reuse it and then you modify the group later, you have this cascading problem where it affects previous places where you use those. And so I started worrying more and more about that. And so if I make a group, it's something where it has to specifically be something that I'm never going to touch again. Make sure you label stuff. Start using frames, use colors, use text. Watch out for cascading changes. A lot of times changing something way up in the start of something would break things down the line. And so you have to watch about that. And, yeah. So let's look at some of these swords. This was the first sword, the witch sword. And again, a lot of times in the beginning, I wasn't really focused on making this a really witchy sword. I was still building the initial architecture for this sword. So I got the foundations of how the hilt and the blade extend upward. There's like an auto-generated hilt and handle. And a lot of this was just curves with controls for profiles, both in the left and right, and also what the curve profile object is. Eventually I did need something that represented the theme, though, so I kind of just at the last minute figured out, well, what if I just instant objects at the end of these hilts and at the end of the handle? And so I ended up making a pumpkin generator, which was actually the most important or interesting thing about this. So here you can see some of the initial layout stuff for how this curve was generated as I go through this. First it's just a curve, and then you can bend it a little bit. You can then change how it finally becomes a mesh object, switching between curves for a spirally curve or a flat curve. And then same thing for the blade, making the blade pop up, switching between different profiles with a float curve for how it goes together, and then sticking all that in the UI. As for the pumpkin generator, the pumpkin ended up being its own interesting thing that I really loved. And I thought about all these different things, like, do I want to be able to automatically generate a smile? Because a lot of that, those square teeth are pretty mathematical. Or do I want this to be something where, again, when do you want the user to have access to a GUI? And a lot of the time, what I want to do nowadays is I want to draw the curved shape of a face myself. Hence, something like this, where I literally could write in the word pumpkin generator and have it work. And so this ended up being lots of stuff, and also using a lot of those best practices of, you want to be able to Alt-S and Control-T, twist this stuff. What ended up happening here? So here you can see there's several curves that go together to make this pumpkin. You can twist them and move them in and out. Getting the divot to go in is harder, because a lot of this pumpkin, although it looks big and fat, is actually a curve that's turned into a mesh with a different curve project. So using these empties, I'm able to put those divots back in. Here you can see some of the math that goes into making these square teeth. And a lot of this was very intense modulo discovery, where a lot of times, it's hard to figure it out. And if you just click all the buttons, you get happy accident. But so all those curves eventually go inside of there. I also found that if you're using anything with booleans, it's very good to have in your UI some checkbox where you can temporarily turn it off. And that way you can temporarily focus on the design of what you're making for it. And then when you actually want to see what it looks like, you turn it on. And I eventually made a candle in this as well. So the boolean that cuts out the face and cuts out the innards, that was really expensive, and I wanted to have that be something that turns it off. This is another best practice that I discovered, which is UV unwrapping your curves. It's so handy to use curves in geometry nodes. And if you UV unwrap them, it turns out that not only is that useful for applying materials, but later on you can actually reuse that data. And also, it's cheaper than index sorting as far as figuring out the math goes. This was another little toy that I made, and again, it's just an example of how there's utilities within utilities within utilities inside of these geometry nodes files. So this is a star generator that I made, and again, you can change the number of points, but there's these helper curves that you can turn on and off and determine how saw-bladed it is or how flat and fluffy it is. And based on this, I can just have this one object that handles 99% of the curve choices when I need something that is round and it goes up. This is a quick screenshot of how exactly that curve generator or that superstar is made. So feel free to screenshot that and recreate it. This is also nodes for the pumpkin sawtooth, and you can see a lot of truncated modulos combined with other truncated modulos in and, or, and not combinations to finally get these separated teeth chunks. And the nice thing about that is because those modulos not only change it, they're also selections, so you can then change individual edges to make the teeth thicker or thinner. So this is my next sword, the wizard sword, and again, a lot of this is still just using a default interface of the handle generator and the hilt generator, plus just throwing an object in the instance object on the end. But I wanted to do something, I was trying to brainstorm an interesting concept, and I had this idea that you have this spellbook, and the wizard's blade comes out of the spellbook, connecting to the handle. So you're almost like throwing your book around. The pommel is actually a pentagram, and I also figured out how to make a pentagram generator. It starts off with actually a pretty conventional model. It's just a little book with 2 bones, and it makes it go back and forth. And that's how I get this little flying flap to it. The geometry nodes is the last thing. And from there, I have this curved line that goes up. I instance the book back onto the end point of that. You can then add noise to this curve and have that animated. You can soften the noise. You can change how extreme it is. And you just have a float curve that determines how there's less of that noise at the top and the bottom. So the noise only happens in the middle parts of it. Now another quirk of geometry nodes here is that a lot of times you can just throw a realized instance node in there whenever you're having problems, and a lot of times that just solves your problems. But it can also cause problems. So for instance, this book started off as a mesh with UVs, and when you would realize instances after instancing at that point, that would destroy it. So you have to sometimes be careful with that. The next sword was the rogue sword, and this one I started really feeling the psychosis of going down into this geometry nodes rabbit hole. As you can see, it's sort of a gambling-based sword with 3 different generators on it. So at this point, I'm not using any of the initial sword hierarchy that I had designed. It has the spinning blade made out of cards, kind of like Gambit from the X-Men. It has a roulette wheel for its hilt, and it has for its handle a stack of poker chips. The roulette wheel starts off conventionally enough. It's just a cylinder that you generate using parameters, and then inset faces. You move that down as a selection. You inset faces again. You move that down. You inset faces again. Eventually, this is followed up by some modulo of every other face to determine which ones are the red or black spaces, as well as getting that gold inlay from the leftovers. And then the poker chips are something where, again, I'm starting to mostly ignore materials, but I do use geometry nodes to pass an attribute along here, which sort of generates where the the stack varies, and then that's used to drive where this color ramp shows up, so you get different chips of different colors. As for the blade, this is a collection with various different cards in it, and all of them are instanced along this curve. And then way up in the beginning of this curve is generated actually from a circle curve, which is then twisted. So by rotating that initial circle, you can have this cards go up and down in a very wonky blade-like fashion. And then, again, afterwards, I parameterized everything and started adding things like randomness or how much they're rotated. The cards themselves are a generator. So I went through and I figured out how to make some sort of card generator where I could just go through and change the suit or the number on a whim, as well as changing like the fillet on the corners and stuff. I found that it was really hard to parse out like what would the mathematics of like the amount of symbols inside of the card be, and where do you place them? So if it's a 10, what's the logical way that you would make a 10? I could not solve this to save my life. So eventually I figured out, let's just have this be vertex groups that we assign, and then we would just have one vertex group per thing and just manually change it. The symbols themselves are also a geometry nodes group. So I went down to the holes of the internet and found how to generate things like a heart or a club or a diamond from math. And eventually, like for the club, I was just starting to get a headache. It was like, how do you generate a club? And I eventually realized, I should just use a character map. I should have done this for all 4 suits at the start. But so just using a character map that has a little symbol or a letter for the club was the easiest way to get a club sign and then put it on all over the place. And then you can change the size of the symbols, the size of the letters, stuff like that. As for the wizard pentagram, this was just a really quick, easy fix. This was using the connect points group, I think from Arendelle. And you just do that for everything, and suddenly, if you have a circle with 5 points, or with 5 edges, every single one of them is connected. Boom, you have an instant pentagram. Nice and easy. And then parameterize everything. So for the Dragon Slayer sword, I started feeling kind of bad about how I'd made 3 swords and none of them looked like a sword yet. So I decided I needed to get back to that. And I wanted to get back to some of my initial thoughts and daydreams about the ideal interface for these, where you just go whoosh, swish, and then those curves that you draw become your cool sword. I also was starting to think, what would I do for a dragon sword? And I thought about like, the flesh of the gums, and this is more of a demon sword at this point. But so I ended up making it covered with blood and flesh that kind of can grow on it. And this ended up being one of my favorites, especially that handle down in the bottom, where you can basically make it a throbbing handle of meat and teeth. So as for the initial curves, a lot of these are something where it just has an Alt-S amount of scale to it. You can also pull off a secondary edge here to have something that is generated along one end of this. This is, again, done by index moduloing out, index sorting. And then you generate all these goo lines on there, which is through a group that sort of takes the endpoint, extrudes it out, and shrink wraps it on there. I was trying to remember how to do this. And basically, it's just a group that happens over and over where, again, you just extrude it a little bit and you set position to whatever the closest area of the sword is. So you can then add a little bit of randomness. And so it's these little tendrils that sort of swoop outward along the blades and then suction back onto the sword. As for the meat handle, this is something where it's, once again, just a curve, but it's instancing little blobs along there. You control their thickness through both the parameters that I set up and also the interface of where you scale it. You then have these teeth that are also made from actually 2 curves put together. But the fun thing is you can use these in tandem. You can use these for geometry proximity and push those gums in and also get little selections around like the rims of this. So I was able to make it look really sort of gingivitis and like, throbbing along the teeth. This was probably one of my favorite things that I made on this sword journey. As for the Spy Master, I sat and I pondered, what would a spy use? And of course, it would have to be something that you can use in without being detected. And so I thought, of course, how about an umbrella generator? And so this one generates both a capsule-shaped handle so that it's different from a curve that is just extruded out. But also it has these umbrella spokes that go around. You can control how many of the spokes are there, how bent they are, how often they go around, the resolution on everything, as well as the fabric along there and how often the fabric comes out. So here you can see an initial sense of this. And this was a problem that was bugging me forever, which is how do you get the umbrella fabric to have some sort of bend to it? How can you make it look like the wind is blowing it up or the gravity is pulling it down? How can you make it look loose or thin? And I eventually realized tessellate is the best option. So several users have put tessellate nodes out there in their geometry nodes packs. And so if I can generate a plane that goes along two spokes with just individual planes, I can then tessellate in a strip that has more geometry and also geometry that goes up and down. And so by doing that, I'm able to get these little selection masks that I can make go up or down. And that way I don't have to do it manually. Here's nodes about how it works. I don't remember how any of this works. I hope you can figure it out. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. One thing you can note is that I think I'm maybe using some UV unwrapping here. No, not yet. Can't even see my own screen. But if you follow these, you can just copy and paste a lot of these things. And then a lot of this is just put stuff on the ends. Again, going back to this idea that my swords are like way off the grid. I need to get back to actual swords that look swordy. And I decided to give myself a little break and do something that was closer to traditional modeling. So this sword was actually doing something with hard ops and Boolean style modeling. But obviously I needed to stick to my geometry nodes goal here. And so there's a couple of tiny uses of geometry nodes, and I really love this idea of geometry nodes not having to be the coolest thing in the history of the world. You can just do one tiny thing with it. So for instance, one problem with hard ops is that you're restricted to only the modifiers that exist in a Boolean workflow with hard ops or box cutter. But there's all sorts of new modifiers you can make with geometry nodes, because geometry nodes let you abstract anything into a modifier. And so one example of this is that there's no inset base modifier. And so one of the problems that you run into with hard ops is, like, let's say you just want to have a profile and then start from there. It starts off as a flat plane, which means it's not full geometry, which means you can't do Boolean interface stuff with it. And so through geometry nodes, I was able to just do this one tiny inset face. So I start off with this profile that I just model really simply. I inset the face is extruded out, you mirror it, you merge it, and suddenly you have something where a single two-dimensional profile of a object can be used in geometry or in a hard ops workflow. And so it's just one tiny little button, or it's one tiny little thing in this giant modifier stack, but it pays out. As for the text, this was a lot of fun. I figured out like how to, I wanted to have some sort of rune generator, and so you can see you can enter any sort of string, in this case D's nuts, and it will turn it into runes that then go along this sword. And so a lot of these is, once again, turning this into various things. Again, I don't remember how to do this. Look at the notes. It's right there. As for the handle, I wanted that sort of leather grip, like somebody had made this in an actual Viking village. And my solution was to create a spiral. You change its dimensions to the domain size of the handle. So if you drew a box around the handle, this is how big the handle is. You then make the spiral fit that. You can then use raycasting to throw the spiral only on the X and Y directions so that it lands on the handle. And so by doing this, you get this handle object that you can make, which was also Boolean modeled, but it just instantaneously has this sort of rope leather wrapped around it. And then all those things are once again parameterized. As for the Oracle sword, I once again started going a little off grid with this one. You can see this is reusing the pentagram, but I wanted some sort of sword that predicted some sort of future death. And so this was the sword that came out, and it makes these little energy glows that also attach to some sort of vision that's getting projected. This is a really fun process where you start with, again, a plane that is just automatically made. You then have curves sort of attached to the points on the start. So like if you create points on that face and then extrude them, you have every other point go back to the center. And so then you have lines. If you have those, you can divide them and then you can add noise and make them crazy. From there, I turn those curves into meshes. I remesh them with mesh to volume and then volume to mesh. And then you can smooth it by blurring the position. And then you get this sort of goopy looking energy tendrils. And so there's no simulation here, but it feels really kind of weird and simulated. The Jester was another one of my favorites. It's not only just kind of off-grid, but it was just really fun to make. And so this one is like really abstract. It's a sort of jack-in-the-box spike that comes out. And again, I used a lot of moduloing, and a lot of these are, once again, curves where I can switch between. Do you want to have it auto-generate and just flat back and forth in a procedural way? Or do you want to draw the exact way that this is coming out and attacking somebody and twisting? So, again, it's still just a curve with a profile. All I do from there is modulo things based on the amount around it, which is brought in as a parameter that users get to define. And then you can make cutouts for where these metal inlays are, where the separate black and red chunks are. The box lid also is something where you can make it open and close. And here we're getting into some tricky stuff because you're basically rigging in geometry nodes now. And by using the bounding box, you can get like the far left point on the far left and bottom point and set that as the place where it rotates. So you can have both the lid and the box underneath it generated based on that, and then make them operate separate. Again, this was something I found when I was really starting to get frustrated with how often I was just staying up late, typing in random numbers to these modulo math nodes and getting something I didn't agree with. And then I realized, going way back to my initial philosophy that you should have curves that can always twist, always alt S scale, and always have UV unwrapping, I should just break open or reverse engineer the UV unwrap. So by pulling the UV unwrap into a separate XYZ node, you can then just have it going up along there and having it go around. And so by doing that, I can use that as a selection mask. And so that's how I ended up getting these little chunks pulled out. Modulo is dead to me now. The Royal Hunt Leader sword is also one of these swords that is more swordy, finally getting back to sword stuff. I wanted it to have a Bowie knife sensibility, and I wanted it to also have that feeling of a user interface that was childlike, where you say, my sword is swooshy like this. And when you look at a lot of swords that are designed like really heavy Final Fantasy swords, there's like this forward edge that's really cool. There's the tang of the blade that is also a different shape. And then lastly, you have the back edge. And so like I wanted to be able to draw those three separate things and have them combined. And that's where I came across this idea of curve sorting. If you have a curve object and you implicitly assume that it's going to have three splines, 0, 1, and 2, you can connect those three splines as your methodology. And so you can have a curve object where you draw three splines, and one of them is automatically going to be the front edge at the 0 index. The next one is going to be the tang at the 1 index, and the next is going to be the back at the 2 index. And as for the handle, this was another one where this ended up informing some of my sculpting philosophies later. But I wanted to just draw the handle shape as a circle and have it be that handle shape. And so I started making this blob generator that paid off. And then once again, you can kind of see it here. But I'm still also just every once in a while throwing in some Boolean hard ops workflows. Let's play this. So you can see it makes all sorts of weird ones, although I do have some sort of bug in there. So this is how this index sorting works. Again, I have a curve with spline 1, 2, and 3, and then it combines them all. And it starts by assuming that the point of the blade is going to be the pointy part, and they all have to end at the handle. So I set all of their positions to the index of the first thing. Then I'll fix it in edit. So I set all of their origins to the end index of the first blade, or the first spline. Oh, cut. It's fine. Everything is fine. So I set all of their positions to the index of the last point on the middle spline, and then rotate them around there. So it's sort of like this. Then you scale them all to the end point where they meet the handle. So that lets you kind of do these individually, and the curves can kind of be a mess, but they all still start at this final point and then end at the handle. Wow, I don't remember any of these things, but it looks cool. So this sort of takes you through this, and I think I end up using that, what's it called? Here you can see how the handle is put together. A lot of this starts off with a curve object that you initially grab. From there, you have to somehow make this into a mesh. So what I do is I create a circle, a mesh circle, that has the exact same number of Bezier points as the curve object. Then what happens is, since now it's a mesh, you can fill that mesh, you can extrude it, inward from there, and then lastly mirror it and combine it all. And very cool. Also a little bit of hard ops at the end. But here you can see that curve sort of letting you make this any handle shape you want. As for the healer blade, this one was way off grid, and I thought, what would a healer fight with? And I came up with this syringe, which ended up being really fun, and this was my first use of the repeat zone. And so you can see it makes a plunger, you got the canister for it, and then you make a little needle that goes in. Oh my god, I spent way too many hours making this one, and it has so many parameters, but it's really fun to use. Once again, I recommend having something where you can turn off the expensive stuff. So I think in this case, the most expensive thing was the repeat zone generated numbers, which are accurate to the millimeter. Start off with this blade. It's nothing fancy. I start off with the curve to mesh, and you can make it bigger or smaller. And then lastly, it's doing something to cut it off at the end, or sort of shear it. As for this one, wow. You just got to download the file and figure it out that way. That's the fun of geometry nodes. You go back to your old files and you're like, I have no idea how this works. As for the number generator, again, this is the repeat zone. The main thing you want to note is that the repeat has this starting value, and the first thing that happens to it is you add 1 to it. Then you do a bunch of stuff to that. You make that add, or that number into a string, turn that into curves, you position it. You use that number to inform its position so that it's continuously moving up. And then you plug that back in at the end of the repeat zone. It's gray on gray, so it's a little hard to see. But then the next time through, you end up adding 1 to it, and it starts off at 2. So you end up having this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and each time it goes up a certain distance. So that was my experience making swords out of geometry nodes. And I think here's some of my final takeaways. Time is your greatest currency in life. If you have the summer off, make a cool project. I do think monthly challenges are a lot of fun, and they can make you get out of a sort of artist block where you're not doing anything. And it gives you some direction when you're otherwise just going to sit there looking at a blank file, or you don't know what to do in Blender yet. It's good to have external motivation. It's good to have a community. One of the things that really kept me going was hanging out with my Seattle Blender user group friends and showing them what I was learning and also what I was frustrated with. And we could learn as a community, where if I didn't know it, sometimes they knew how to solve something that was mathematical or complex that I was really struggling with. I would also say watch out for geometry nodes. There is the problem where you think you can make everything with generators, and then you think, why should I make something manually by modeling it when I can make a generator and make thousands of them, which I'm only going to use one time. So a lot of times, you should save it for times where you're actually going to use this over and over and over again. Case in point, would I ever use this to make a sword? Maybe, I guess. Would I do this process again? Probably not with swords, but maybe some new subject. However, what did I learn from this and what do I gain from it? I have absolutely used chunks of this project everywhere in my workflow since. I always find myself going back to these files now, and there was some problem that I solved. I go back to the file, I remember how I did it, and I copy and paste those nodes into whatever new boondoggle I'm on. So I want you to accumulate as many geometry nodes projects as possible, because it ends up being this big storage unit for all those times you used to be smart, when you sit down at a computer and you forgot it all. And then lastly, how did I do? Well, technically I only got to 10 swords out of this 15. But if you look at the number of generators I made within this, again, something like the Rogue sword, where I ended up making like 4 different generators just for this one sword. I ended up making like 24 really cool, useful projects. And so in that sense, I beat my goal of 15. So yeah, that's Geometry. And do we have time to make swords? Well, go to the Gumroad file and you can go play with it yourself. So if you make a sword, go send it to me. Thanks. Again, I'm Oscar Baechler, and it was nice to talk to you guys.